I'm Curtis Wilkie, an Overby Fellow. Well, I'm a friend of Bill's, but we also have 3 friends of Bill's here. Of course, Ellen Ann, you met earlier. Joe Atkins in the middle, worked in Jackson as a journalist for the Jackson Daily News, the late Jackson Daily News, and happily for the last few years has been on the faculty of journalism at Ole Miss. And at my far left, Reverend David Elliott, a native Mississippian who has served in Jackson for a number of years and right now is here in an interim position at St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Oxford. Let me start off, David, just to get things going, to ask you, so much of Ellen Ann's film dealt with civil rights, and understandably during that period, but in the city of Jackson and the state of Mississippi, what kind of moral force is Bill Miner?
Bill Miner was, I think, and still is, a very, very moral force. He said something I put down right at the end. I think he said something, if I can. But basically what he said, he's still writing. If you read the Clarion Ledger on Fridays, he's still in there, and he's still making people mad. He really is. He's speaking his honesty, he's speaking his morals, he's speaking what he believes, and he's hacking a lot of people off, and that's what he does best because he tells the truth. And,
Joe, what's your favorite memory of Bill working in Jackson as a fellow journalist?
I didn't come to Mississippi until 1981, and soon after coming here, I stumbled across an old edition of the Capitol Reporter, and I said, "Man, this is a great publication, and doing some really good stuff." And soon after that, would meet Bill Miner and be able to work with him. And I'd worked with Claude Sitton before I got down here, so I feel like I was 2 of the greatest civil rights reporters ever. You know, I was covered state government with the Daily News, and so I got to work with Bill in the bureau up there at the state capitol. And one funny story was over the intercom we could hear the legislators in the House arguing back and forth about some piece of legislation. And there were several of us in the press room upstairs and just listening to the debate. And some legislator, distraught, was in the microphone and says, "When is Mississippi ever going to get into the 20th century?" This was like 1985 or something. And Bill Miner said, "Never." It was funny story.
But he tried to tug us in there.
But he tried his best to help me, and I think he did.
Yeah, he's a really indefatigable character because for all of the talk of Jim Amos and the role that he played with the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. I grew up reading Bill Miner as a young boy in South Mississippi when he was covering the state for the Times-Picayune. And they basically abolished the position of Mississippi correspondent. And then, rather than be silenced, he went out and he bought the Capitol Reporter, and that failed eventually. Here he is, all these years later, still at it. Could you talk just a little bit about the progression of positions Bill has had, as a journalist, starting as a reporter for the Times-Picayune, going to the Capitol Reporter, to this day still a columnist?
So I think yes, yeah, he wants to have his voice heard. I think he's gonna go out writing. He started with the Times-Picayune after the war. Actually, he started a little before. He was a Tulane grad, and they had told him when he came back he'd have a job waiting. And now in the filming, he was shaking his head. Why did he take them so literally? Like his first day out of the Navy, he went to work for the Times-Picayune. He said he maybe should have gone back to school or something. But yeah, he worked on the city desk in New Orleans for a year before he came to Jackson. And I think Hank brings up a good point, Hank Klibanoff in there, about really he was on his own. He could have done what he wanted to. He took the initiative to have this kind of a passion and this kind of this kind of like proactive choices on what he did. He was really kind of sent up to cover the legislature. So, yeah, and then with the Capitol Reporter, I wonder if it were around now, what would be, it was just way ahead of its time. It was the, 1976 to 1981. Hardly anyone had ever heard of an alternative weekly. Now every city has one. And also, I think you just with the model of newspapers now, I just wonder, would have been what it would have been now, like a blog or whatever, an online presence. But I think the value of Bill, and for someone, can you imagine covering a place for 69 years? And and he was not one that just did car wrecks and it just was a new thing every day. The value of Bill, and I don't think how many states have this, is someone with this kind of an institutional memory to know what goes what and this falls in line with that. And an interesting thing, I don't know if y'all ever ran across it with him. I've never seen anyone whose memory is organized like Bill's. If you would say something about the highway bonds, and he would say, "Oh, that was in the 1983 legislature." He can his mind is organized by years. I can maybe kind of vaguely know issues and administrations, but what a memory! And occasionally he'll make a mistake, but 99% of the time he is exactly right about something and a name and an event and an exact year.
Yeah, that's what he does a lot of times on Fridays at the Clarion Ledger. He will go back and he can, with that photographic memory, almost tell you exactly what happened 30 or 40 years ago and talk about that all over again. People don't like to have that brought up anymore.
And the way he has just the big picture and the long, this like 7 decades of a narrative thread of Mississippi. An interesting thing to me was the film was finished and it premiered at Millsaps 3 days before the Charleston shooting. So I don't know if y'all were taken aback by all those Confederate flags. This is when we finished it, this had not happened. And I know there was someone in the audience who was a professional who had moved to Mississippi, had never lived in the South before, and had recently moved to Mississippi. She was at the showing, and after all of the Charleston shooting and all the questioning about unfinished business with the Civil War and the Confederate flag, she said when she saw the film, she thought, he's really exaggerating, that he is living in the past if he still thinks that we're dealing with the Civil War and that, and that there's an obsession with the Confederate flag. And then she just wanted to say that, she saw he was right, exactly right.
Well, that institutional knowledge, it informs his columns even today, and yet he's always doing fresh reporting too. It's amazing to think that that this guy in his 90s now is still out there gathering the information that he's able to gather, and it's a real gift to Mississippi, I think. In preparation for this event, I was just going through his book, Eyes on Mississippi, that he published a collection of his columns some years back, and just reading some of his early columns in the 1940s, articles in 1947, he starts out his first big story is Bilbo's funeral, Theodore Bilbo, the racist senator from Mississippi, and how in a way, it's kind of like the stars were aligned for Bill Miner to cover this tumultuous period of history in Mississippi, because the stage was set right there, for the next 50 years, I think.
Interesting. There is another thing that it didn't make it in here. There's so many great stories. And by the way, we're hoping to do a second 40 hours of tape. And so many things in Mississippi happened. As he said, 1964, the Civil Rights Act, that didn't mean it was over in Mississippi. So many things happened after 64. So the goal is to do another one and take up the story possibly with the Voting Rights Act of 65. We've gotten a humanities grant to get going on that, so hopefully that'll happen soon. But one thing that didn't make it into this, his first session covering the Mississippi legislature in 1948, I guess, there was an issue, maybe someone here knows about it. It was a bus strike. It was like maybe Continental Trailway strike. This wasn't a racial issue, it was about labor. But Bill had written some stories, and someone had brought up that there was the patrol or whatever they'd done in Mississippi, kind of strike busting, was accusing it of being the patrol of being a Gestapo force. And Bill wrote all these stories up, and the famous A.J. Liebling dealing with the New Yorker happened to read these stories. He got newspapers from all over the country. He was a little baffled because he had seen nothing about this from the Associated Press. Why is this guy in New Orleans writing about it and it hadn't been in the Associated Press anywhere? And he got in touch with Bill and talked to him. And so Bill's first session, he ends up in the New Yorker. But a very interesting thing happened out of that. Liebling wrote the stories, but because of that, the Associated Press changed their way of filtering stories. Before that, I believe the stories were, they kind of went into Atlanta, and then someone there made the call on whether they went national. But after that, they didn't. After that, the stories, there was someone at the National in New York that looked at everything and made the call. And Bill said that sort of set the stage for civil rights reporting in the South, because then there were going to be national eyes looking at it, and it wasn't going to be left to someone who's, you just don't know how they stood if they look, because the Associated Press was at the Clarion Ledger office for many years.
Yeah. David, you're an old timer like me. You remember the Hederman Press in Jackson, in reference to it in the film. Just disgraceful in terms of their coverage of civil rights movement, or their failure to cover it. Do you appreciate the irony today that Bill Minor's voice is still being heard in Mississippi in the Clarion Ledger under new ownership?
I think it's very much of an irony. I'll never forget watching DeLay Beckwith up there. If you remember what the headline was in the Clarion Ledger, Californian kills, a Californian arrested for Medgar Evers. I mean, for the murder. And of course, he was born in California. He left there when he was 2 days old, and lives in Greenwood, Mississippi. And he was an Episcopalian. I do not say that proudly by any means. He was an Episcopalian. I have a letter from him that he wrote to our bishop about race mongering in the church. And I did but it's a long story. I did a church on the what was called back then the Negro in the church. I did an honors paper in seminary on that. But I got a letter from DeLay about that, about his letter to Bishop Gray back then.
Yeah.
But one of the things it brought up too, the whole change. It brought up so much watching Meridian. I was born and raised in Meridian. And I was in Meridian in 1964 when all of that was going on, with the '64 Civil Rights Summer. And seeing the courthouse there brought back so many memories. I was in the insurance business then. And my insurance company that I was with, a group called Myron Rosenbaum, we wrote the fire insurance for COFO. Now, COFO was Congress of Federated Organizations, which was it made me, as a businessman back then, it gave me a real good view of persons in the business world, because it took quite a risk to write fire insurance on a COFO organization back then, but these people were ready to do it too, and they did, and I was very proud to work for them. One of the men you saw in the Alton Wayne Roberts, I went to high school with, and Alton Wayne and I, we were in different grades. He had the reputation of being just I'll say a bad person. I won't really say what I really want to say. But he came up behind me in the hall one day at Meridian High School and hit me in the back. Well, I turned around and I hit him in the stomach. Well, he was so surprised somebody hit him back. And I was so scared after I saw who it was. We got along fine after that. But he's the one that pulled the trigger, which was very, very scary. It really was.
Any questions from you all? Yes, sir.
Ellen Ann, do you remember the bricks coming through the plate glass window at the Capitol Reporter?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah, oddly, Bill, he lived us through some dangerous times. I know when they were looking for the bodies in Neshoba County for 40 days that he didn't stay there overnight. Cloud Sitton did, and he was threatened. Some people offered him, did anyone to get in their car and go sip some moonshine with him, and they said no. But he never had an overt threat where he felt danger. But during the time of the Capitol Reporter, he had a cross burned, and we had a brick thrown through the window. We didn't have any money for heat, and so we could see our breath all winter. So thanks to the Klan.
One week he was gone, and he told me to write the editorial. criticizing the gas company. And when Bill came back on Monday and read it, he said, "My God, Cotton, that's the last paying advertiser we have."
Yes, sir.
Joe, who owned the Jackson Daily News?
Well, the Hederman family when I first got there in late '81, but then Gannett came, I guess, what, six months or so later. So
They owned two papers that I always knew they owned the Clarion Ledger.
they own the Jackson Daily News too. And I guess I didn't do my research. I was hired down from, well, I just finished school up in D.C. and I worked in North Carolina before that, but I came down and I was in our, I was looking at some old New York Times papers while I was there, not long after I got there, and I found a reference to an editorial in the New York Times that called the Jackson, Clarion Ledger, and Daily News the most racist papers in the United States back in the 60s. I said, gosh, I didn't even know that, you know. I mean, I found out that history pretty quickly, you know.
How did they hire you, though?
Bob Gordon, who used to be the managing editor at the Daily News, had worked in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I'd worked before, and I guess he had talked to the folks up there, and my fiance was from Mississippi, and so I'd applied different places, and she said, "Why don't you try Mississippi?" And I did, and so Bob Gordon gave me a call.
Well, it
So I
was
got
beginning to change a little bit.
Yeah,
by
it was,
that time.
it was,
Was
yeah.
Ray Hederman by that time?
Ray Hederman had been there, I guess, a year or two before I
Was
got there.
much more visionary than his.
Yes. We still had Jimmy Ward around, who was
Oh my God.
the fiery segregationist, the unreconstructed rebel from the past, but he was sort of on the downhill slide at that point, I think.
Any other questions from you all? Well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you all for joining in this discussion. Ellen Ann, great film. We want to see more.
I want to do it the second half. I'm hoping to be able to get it aired on PBS. I'm working. Anybody has any friends and neighbors at PBS, let me know.
You're great.
Thank you all.
Thank you.